Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in New Mexico. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. In the early months of 1871, in a remote stretch of what was then the New Mexico Territory, a small frontier settlement called Coyote's Hollow lay near a rugged canyon, half forgotten on the maps of territorial clerks. The wind in January was biting, and the dust storms frequently swept across the mesa, leaving drifted sand across every doorstep. Into that desolate scene rode a deputy named Ezekiel Zeke Morton, who arrived under a muted sky, his boots heavy with desert grit. He carried with him a subtle reputation. Among territorial records, he was one of several deputies dispatched in the past decade to maintain some semblance of law in a region rife with bandit raids, cattle rustling, and disputes over land claims. The little town had been long accustomed to lawmen drifting in, some competent, some corrupt, but Morton's arrival prompted attention. He was tall, gaunt, with a sallow complexion, and an unnerving calm. Townsfolk later recalled the first evening he spent in the dusty parlor of the only inn, sitting rigid at his table with steely eyes, drinking water without a word. His badge gleamed faintly in candlelight. The sheriff of that district was a distant figure, often unreachable by telegraph, leaving deputies like Morton to handle grave matters on their own. Coyote's Hollow itself had a murky past. It grew around a watering hole that earlier settlers often called Black Spring, because in dry months the water ran dark with sediment. The original homesteaders had perished in harsh winters, and their cabins lay empty, half buried in sand. During those early years, ghost stories circulated. Lodgers said they heard soft scratching in walls at night, or footsteps pacing outside the shutters when no one was awake. These rumors persisted even as new families arrived, ranch hands, prospectors, itinerant traders. One elderly homesteader, Mary Little, told a visiting journalist in 1882 that in 1865 she'd found strange footprints around her cabin, too narrow to be a man's and too deep for a dog's. By the time Morton arrived, the settlement counted perhaps 20 adults, rough men accustomed to danger, but uneasy with disappearances. Within weeks, reports in the county clerk's ledger and evening journals began to note missing men. First, a drifter named Tom Winters vanished after visiting the bathhouse. Then, a stray Mexican laborer, assigned to repair a board fence, failed to return to his lodging. No bodies, no trails, only silence. The first odd incident came on a moonless night in February. A neighbor, Jonas Reed, swore he heard muffled screams and the metallic clang of shackles from the direction of the old spring. He rose and peered through the shutters. He claimed to see a dim silhouette dragging something across the yard, green mist rising from the ground. Terrified, he locked his shutters and slept beside his loaded rifle. In the morning he swore the spring water was stained, dusky red at the edges, and he found a scrap of cloth caught on a rock, torn and soaked, with a smear of dark residue. He submitted an affidavit to the deputy's desk. "I believe a foul thing has been committed by some creature in human guise." The local newspaper in the territory's capital printed a brief mention of Reed's tale, labeling it unverified rumor, though the clerk's notes in the county seat included Reed's signed statement in a drawer labeled Coyote's Hollow Missing Persons, 1871. Morton responded by riding out at dawn to examine the spring ascent and its surroundings. He found scuffed earth near the banks, shallow depressions suggesting digging, and traces of a rotten leather strap. He questioned ranch hands in neighboring draws, but received vague answers. He left at dawn. He was last seen walking toward the canyon. We heard nothing unusual. A few of the settlers whispered that Morton bore an unnatural stillness, that his eyes seemed to follow you. They recalled how he would wander at odd hours by lantern toward the old cabins beyond the ridge, always alone. As weeks passed, more vanished. A miner named Silva, a teamster named Carver. The ledger in the clerk's office grew, each missing person annotated with the time of last sighting, usually after dusk. The townspeople asked for intervention from the territorial governor's office, some citing the example of Sheriff Harvey Whitehill in Grant County, whose cautious but firm peacekeeping in nearby southwestern New Mexico had gained him wary respect. Wikipedia. But Coyote's Hollow was so remote that the usual chain of command rarely reached it. One evening in late spring, a terrified ranch hand burst into Morton's rented room at the inn. He claimed he had stumbled across a half-buried pit behind an old barn, smelling of iron and decay. He told Morton, "I believe what's dead lies beneath there, and it wasn't buried long." Morton nodded, retrieving his lantern, and motioned silence. He told the man to return at dawn and bring trusted hands to assist. But that night, the ranch hand never returned. At sunrise, the innkeeper's boy noticed Deputy Morton's lantern still burning dimly in his room, though the bed was unslept in and the window stood open to the cold desert air. A horse was missing from the stable, the same the ranch hand had tied the previous night. The boy, uneasy, fetched his father, who in turn rode to the sheriff's office in the next township, 40 miles east. There, a clerk named Josiah Trent recorded the incident under "Unconfirmed Disappearance, Deputy Morton, Coyote's Hollow Precinct." By noon, a small party rode west to investigate. They found the deputy's horse grazing loose near the old barn the ranch hand had mentioned. The ground nearby was disturbed, sections of sand recently overturned and tamped down by boot heels. Beneath a collapsed timber, they uncovered a shallow trench. Within, they found 3 objects: a torn deputy's belt, a rusted badge, and a length of chain scored with black residue. The smell was overpowering, mixed with the tang of ashes. The local coroner, Dr. Elias Boone, was summoned from Fort Bayard. His notes, preserved decades later in a family trunk, described the site in clinical detachment. Bones charred but not consumed, likely burned in a pit with animal fat or oil. Conditions suggest controlled fire, rather than accidental blaze. The sheriff's office ordered all remains moved to Silver City for further examination. A journey of 2 days through harsh terrain. Rumors grew in the taverns and corrals that Deputy Morton himself had turned executioner, or that bandits had dragged him into the same fate he inflicted on others. A prospector swore he'd seen a flickering light on the mesa nights before, like someone boiling something in a great iron cauldron. Another, an elderly preacher named Reverend Hatch, told the paper in Las Cruces, "The devil rode this valley in a badge, and men trusted him." The connection to other disappearances soon surfaced. In a ledger dated March 4, 1871, Sheriff Whitehill's office in Grant County noted a passing deputy requesting spare shackles and 2 quarts of rendered lard for prisoner provisions. The handwriting, now faded, matched Ezekiel Morton's signature from Coyote's Hollow. Whether the supplies ever arrived or were used as claimed remains unproven, but the detail lodged itself in the folklore that followed. Through April and May, investigative parties scoured the arroyos and abandoned cabins. They found evidence of multiple fires, small circular pits ringed with blackened stones. One contained the melted remains of a belt buckle bearing initials T.W., possibly Tom Winters, the first man missing. In another, a fragment of jawbone, human by Boone's later analysis. The reports were filed but never published widely. The territory's papers were consumed with the Apache raids and railroad scandals of that same year. Those who had known Morton painted conflicting portraits. His former captain in Mesilla claimed he was a man of silence, quick to act, never cruel. But others in Deming remembered an incident of vigilante punishment, where he ordered 2 rustlers locked overnight in an iron tank to sweat out their guilt. Whether this was true or mere saloon gossip, the resemblance to what might have occurred in Coyote's Hollow was chilling. By midsummer, the area was nearly abandoned. Families fled east toward safer towns, leaving empty wells and shuttered windows. Travelers passing through in later years described the site as a patch of scorched earth where no grass grew. Locals said that at dusk, when the wind cut through the canyons, it carried a faint metallic odor and the sound of boiling water. In 1873, a new deputy, Aaron Galt, visited the ruins while mapping routes for the Territorial Marshal Service. His journal entry read simply, "Silence here heavier than lead. Feels watched." Years later, those who examined the surviving county records would note how abruptly the documentation stopped. Between late May and August 1871, entries from the Coyotes Hollow precinct vanished altogether, as though someone had removed pages from the ledger. What remained were faint ink impressions transferred onto the next sheet, ghost words impossible to read fully. A clerk's marginal note from Santa Fe read, "Missing folios, 7 to 9, presumed fire damage." Yet there had been no recorded fire that summer. When Sheriff Harvey Whitehill rode through the region in the autumn of that same year, he took an interest in the case after hearing travelers speak of the boiling deputy. In his later memoirs, preserved by his descendants, Whitehill described stopping at the ruined barn and finding the sand oddly fused, as if oil had been poured and burned into it. He ordered a brief inquest, but by then most witnesses had drifted away or refused to testify. The only resident remaining was the innkeeper's widow, Mrs. Margaret Hale, who claimed she had seen Deputy Morton again, weeks after his supposed death, riding north at dusk, hatless, his head wrapped in a bandage that glistened wet in the fading light. Whitehill's official report listed the matter as unresolved, possible disappearance or derangement, but he also included a private remark. "If this man lives, he travels under another name." That comment fueled speculation for decades. In 1874, a weathered trunk surfaced at a trading post near Fort Selden, sold by an anonymous rider for a few dollars. Inside were lawman's papers bearing Morton's signature and a small notebook filled with erratic entries. Most were mundane, lists of rations, prisoner names, distances ridden, but the final pages changed tone. "The heat makes them speak truth. The lard cleans the sin from bone. I do not err. I only finish what the court begins." The handwriting trembled, ink blotted. Dr. Boone examined the notebook later that year and authenticated the script. His report, found among his estate papers, warned, "If genuine, this reveals a mind disordered by fever or guilt." The territorial marshal's office refused to reopen the case. By 1876, the legend had hardened into story. Campfire tellers along the Jornada del Muerto spoke of a bald rider who carried a copper kettle on his mule and set camp near springs only to leave at dawn, the ground blackened where he stayed. Miners joked that he rendered bandits for lamp oil. Preachers used him as an example of judgment gone astray. Meanwhile, the ruins of Coyotes Hollow continued to erode. Children from nearby ranches dared each other to fetch stones from the deputy's pit. A few fell ill afterward, perhaps from bad water, perhaps from fear. In the archives of Doña Ana County, a single receipt remains from that period: payment to laborers for filling old pits near spring to prevent cattle loss. When Dr. Boone died in 1880, his nephew found among his notes a letter never sent, addressed to Sheriff Whitehill. It ended with the line, "Whatever he began at the spring was not madness alone. He believed he was obeying a law older than the territory itself." By the 1880s, the story of Deputy Ezekiel Morton drifted from official memory into the uneasy category of frontier folklore. Yet pieces of evidence kept surfacing in ways that resisted easy dismissal. In 1881, a pair of railroad surveyors, mapping a spur line through the same county, recorded finding what they called a buried iron vessel, scorched inside, containing bone ash mixed with animal tallow. They turned it over to the territorial office in Mesilla, but the item soon disappeared from inventory. A clerk's later annotation in the margin read only, "Transferred to Silver City, no further trace." That same year, a traveling physician named Dr. Henry Marrow gave a lecture at a mining hall in Socorro, warning of desert fevers caused by evaporating fats. Some listeners noticed that his description of the fumes sounded disturbingly similar to the reports from Coyotes Hollow a decade earlier. When a journalist from the Las Cruces Sentinel sought him out for clarification, the doctor had already left town, headed, they were told, toward the Arizona border, with a single horse and a small copper kettle strapped to his saddle. The paper printed the note under the headline, "Echo of an Old Terror," before moving on to the next week's railroad news. In letters preserved by the Grant County Historical Society, Sheriff Harvey Whitehill mentioned this Dr. Marrow in passing. He wrote that the man's demeanor, gaunt, scarred along the scalp, quiet to the point of hostility, reminded him of a deputy once gone wrong. Whitehill's remark, now part of the family archive, became the closest thing to an eyewitness bridge between the legend and living record. By 1883, Whitehill's own attention had turned elsewhere, but his cautious phrasing kept Morton's name alive among researchers who later sifted the New Mexico archives. Throughout the 1880s, travelers through the southern Torrey reported strange sights along the San Andres Range, the glow of a lantern on nights with no moon, and the faint smell of burning oil carried on the wind. Cowhands claimed to hear the clank of metal from dry ravines. A prospector's note found years later described stumbling upon a pit lined with soot and old badges. He took one as a token and sold it in El Paso. That badge, bent and blistered, ended up in a private collection and, by 1890, was labeled Unidentified Deputy, 1870s. The local clergy viewed the tale differently. Reverend Hatch, now aged and half-blind, preached that Morton's spirit lingered, a lawman who judged beyond mercy. He urged parishioners to avoid the hollow and warned travelers not to drink from its spring. His final sermon, transcribed by a parish youth, ends with a chilling phrase, "The oil of punishment still burns beneath the sand." By 1891, Coyote's Hollow was gone from most maps, absorbed into grazing territory, but researchers decades later, poring through territorial correspondence, found an unsigned letter mailed from Tucson to the Mesilla postmaster. Its handwriting matched Morton's old requisition slips. The brief note read, "Tell Whitehill the law is clean now, the work is done." It was dated January 1891, 20 years after the first murders. The Tucson letter revived curiosity in the old case. County archivist Samuel Durrett, newly appointed to Santa Fe, reopened several forgotten files while compiling reports on territorial law enforcement. Among his findings was the same unsigned note, creased, smudged, but intact. Durrett included it in an 1892 bulletin titled Notable Irregularities in Frontier Records. His tone was scholarly, but the content read like a ghost story. He compared handwriting samples against surviving warrants from the early 1870s. The loop of the T and the downward hook of the M matched Ezekiel Morton's signature precisely. The revelation stirred public interest. For months, regional papers speculated that Morton had lived all those years under assumed names, a drifter's ghost haunting multiple territories. One columnist asked, "Could a deputy become the outlaw he swore to hang?" The article ran beside grainy sketches of desert camps and unmarked graves. In spring 1893, a small expedition sponsored by the Territorial University rode to locate Coyote's Hollow. Among them was Professor Daniel Rusk, an ethnographer who sought to verify oral histories before statehood changed the record. His journal survives. "We found the spring half choked with silt. No birds, no insects. The earth emits a greasy sheen where touched by water. Bones, animal perhaps, perhaps not, lie fused in the clay. We gathered samples discreetly. Local shepherds refused to camp within a mile. They speak of lights and a hum at dusk, like metal cooling." Rusk sent the samples to Albuquerque for analysis. The result came back ambiguous. Organic residues, likely mixed fats. No further conclusion could be drawn. Still, the professor's measured tone lent the legend an air of authenticity. His report circulated among academic societies and was later cited in a 1901 pamphlet on unsolved territorial atrocities. A New South sheriff in Grant County, a distant relative of Harvey Whitehill, visited Santa Fe to view the evidence. He noted that the kettle found years earlier had indeed reached Silver City, but was now missing from storage. The entry line in the property book simply read, "Removed by authorized personnel." No signature followed. In later life, Whitehill himself would speak rarely of the incident. According to a neighbor's reminiscence, he once said over supper, "We never did hang the man who deserved it most." Those words, though casual, echoed through the decades as the closest thing to confession or regret. By 1895, a traveling photographer passing through the ruins of Coyote's Hollow captured an image he titled "The Last Deputy." The plate shows a bald man seated by a dry well, the light catching a faint star-shaped glint on his vest. Experts argue the star was merely a trick of reflection, yet the photograph was later found cracked across the subject's face, as though by deliberate hand. The following winter, a homesteader's wife named Clara Mendez wrote to her sister, describing the site after a storm. "The sand hissed, like water on iron. My husband says it's just wind. I know better. The ground there still cooks." And so, nearly a quarter-century after the first disappearance, the mystery of Deputy Morton lived on, not as record, but as residue, seeping through time like oil through dust. When the 20th century dawned over New Mexico territory, talk of the deputy's cauldron was nearly forgotten among younger settlers. Yet, in certain county offices, the name still lingered in handwritten notes passed from clerk to clerk, warnings about old wells, unexplained burns, and missing travelers. The files were thin, but eerily consistent. Each described the same location near the vanished Coyote's Hollow, a place where soil turned slick after rain, and tools rusted faster than elsewhere. In 1902, a young historian named Lucy Brandt undertook a personal project to catalog frontier myths alongside documented cases. Her mentor at the Territorial Historical Society urged her to seek balance between fact and fear. Lucy traveled to Grant County, where she met aging witnesses of the 1870s events. Some were willing to speak only in hushed tones. One of them, a rancher named Caleb Dorr, described finding a hollow iron hoop half buried by the spring, its inner rim blackened as if from continual heat. "You could still smell it," he said, "like lamp oil and meat gone bad." He told Lucy that as a boy, his father forbade him to go near the place. But when a steer went missing one night, he followed the tracks there and found the carcass half flayed, the hide burned smooth as wax. He claimed no fire was visible, only a shimmer rising from the sand. Lucy documented his statement in her notebook, later depositing it in the Society's archive. She also retrieved a set of copied letters between Dr. Boone and Sheriff Whitehill, photostats fading now but legible. In one, Boone speculated that the deputy's actions might have stemmed from exposure to toxic oil residues used in lantern fuel. "The mind may twist moral duty into ritual purification," he wrote. The language was careful, medical, and hauntingly neutral. As Lucy compiled her findings, she discovered a second line of humor, that Morton had not acted alone. A few locals insisted another deputy, never named in official records, had arrived briefly from the south in early 1871, then vanished. Some speculated he was the one who survived and carried the legend westward. Others believed he perished in Morton's pit, mistaken for an outlaw. To verify these claims, Lucy examined payroll ledgers from the Territorial Marshal's office. Indeed, there was one missing entry for that quarter, a deputy listed only as H.M., assignment undefined. Whether coincidence or cover-up, it added a shadow of plausibility to the whispered second man theory. In her 1904 lecture before the Santa Fe Historical Society, Lucy spoke of Coyote's Hollow as a junction between justice and madness. She referenced Sheriff Harvey Whitehill by name, crediting his early documentation as the reason the case survived at all. The audience reportedly sat silent through her conclusion. Afterward, an elderly man approached her, identifying himself as a retired postal agent from Tucson. He claimed to remember a letter addressed to Messia in 1891, the same one scholars had long debated. He said quietly, "It smelled faintly of oil, miss. I remember because the envelope left a stain on my ledger." That single remark, mundane yet precise, haunted Lucy Brandt for the rest of her life. Her papers, later donated to the University of New Mexico, end with one final line beneath the heading, "Personal Reflection." If there was a Deputy Morton, then the land itself remembers him. Some laws do not fade, they seep. In the spring of 1905, a traveling newspaper correspondent named Edwin Calloway arrived in Silver City to research a series of articles on territorial legends and lost crimes. His notes show that he initially dismissed the Morton affair as romantic nonsense. Yet curiosity drove him to the archives at the courthouse, where he found Boone's autopsy sketch tucked behind unrelated livestock reports. The drawing, a rough outline of a pit surrounded by concentric circles, was labeled "residue of human and animal matter combined." Calloway wrote that such phrasing startled him more than any ghost story. He journeyed to the supposed site, now a barren slope dotted with mesquite and the eroded stumps of old fence posts. Local ranchers avoided it, calling it simply the Hollow. There, Calloway camped for 2 nights. His field diary, preserved in the Territorial Gazette microfilm, describes uneasy dreams of boiling water and voices calling from beneath the sand. On the second night, his horse broke its tether and fled. Calloway claimed he woke to the smell of burnt oil. "It came from nowhere," he wrote. "No fire, no wind, yet the air shimmered like heat over iron." When he returned to town, his boots were stained with a thin waxy film that wouldn't wash off. Laboratory tests conducted weeks later identified it as a mixture of tallow and mineral residue. His published article was restrained but unsettling. He referred to an unrecorded deputy of 1871 who believed the law required purification through flame. It mentioned Sheriff Harvey Whitehill briefly as the man who had first attempted reason where fear prevailed. The piece was widely read, prompting letters from old-timers who swore they remembered Zeke the boiler. One from a retired railroad worker in Lordsburg claimed to have seen a tall, bald man asking after oil supplies sometime in the early 1880s. Calloway pursued that lead, corresponding with supply merchants across the region. 2 confirmed that during those years, an unnamed buyer purchased barrels of animal fat and iron pots, paying in silver but refusing to sign receipts. The handwriting on a surviving note from one store matched Morton's early requisition signature in part, the same slanted E and heavy downward stroke of the M. The implication was unavoidable, though Calloway avoided stating it directly. That autumn, Calloway returned to Silver City to deliver a lecture at the public hall. His presentation, titled "A Deputy's Justice, Myth or Record," drew a full crowd. Witnesses described how he projected lantern slides of the terrain, the Boone sketch, and a blurred image of the 1895 photograph known as The Last Deputy. Midway through, the glass plate cracked under the heat of the lamp, scattering shards across the stage. Calloway paused, visibly shaken, then ended his talk early, saying only, "Some records resist light." He left town the next morning and was never heard from again. His mule and belongings were found weeks later on the road to Deming, untouched, except for the saddlebag where he kept his notes, emptied. The official report filed by the Grant County Sheriff listed the disappearance as unexplained, likely accidental. Yet a single line in the margins, written in pencil by a later archivist, still remains. Coyote's Hollow file. Pattern repeats. By 1908, the legend of Coyote's Hollow had hardened into folklore, yet officialdom refused to let it rest entirely. A statehood survey required every county to verify old territorial boundaries and abandoned settlements. This bureaucratic exercise brought a new group of men into the desolate basin, the engineers of the land office. They found little more than tumbleweed, faint depressions in the ground, and shards of broken crockery. Still, their field supervisor, a pragmatic man named Eli Warren, noted in his logbook, "Soil oily to the touch, dogs refuse to cross." Warren, unlike the storytellers before him, had no interest in ghosts. He believed the residue might come from a seep of mineral oil, common in the region. But when he filed his report in Santa Fe, the clerk responsible for transcription added a remark in neat handwriting. Local superstition ties this to an incident of the 1870s involving a deputy of violent disposition. That clerk, perhaps unknowingly, reignited scholarly curiosity. Around the same year, a young archivist named Michael Dunn revisited Sheriff Harvey Whitehill's personal correspondence for a biography project. Among the sheriff's scattered letters, Dunn found one undated scrap sealed with brittle wax. Inside, in Whitehill's rough hand, was written, If the deputy yet breathes, he is no longer a man. Dunn published the quote in a local periodical, attaching little commentary, yet the sentence was enough to spawn a new wave of fascination among amateur historians and campfire enthusiasts. Meanwhile, in the nearby town of Mesilla, an old prospector named Ezra Cole began telling a story to anyone who'd buy him a drink. He claimed that years earlier, while exploring a dry creek bed, he'd discovered a tarnished badge buried beside a cracked kettle. He sold both to a traveling collector. It had soot all over it, he told listeners, and the star still faintly shone through. Most took it for drunken fancy, but Cole's details matched the long-lost artifact once logged in Silver City. A letter from Dunn to the State Museum director in 1910 reveals that he attempted to trace the collector's identity. Only one man fit the description, a curio dealer from Tucson known as R.L. Mercer, who later died in a hotel fire under uncertain circumstances. When investigators sifted through the ashes, they found melted metal fragments, one shaped like a star. This sequence of coincidences stirred whispers that the deputy's justice still demanded offerings. Some locals began leaving small oil lamps on the ridge near the old spring, a strange form of appeasement that persisted for several years. Newspapers mentioned it only briefly, dismissing it as rustic superstition. But a field diary from a university geologist in 1912 records something harder to explain. After dusk, while collecting mineral samples, I observed a dim flame emerge from a fissure near the spring. It burned steady, blue-white, without visible fuel. The air smelled of lard smoke. When he returned the next morning, there was no trace of fire, only a slick patch glinting under the sun. By 1914, the place was once again deserted. The land office reclassified the site as unfit for settlement due to unstable soil conditions. No one objected. Travelers who took the wrong road sometimes passed through unknowingly, describing afterward a strange quiet and the sense that the ground itself exhaled warmth. Those who lingered said they sometimes heard the faint clink of chains below the surface, as if echoing through stone. The reports dwindled as New Mexico approached statehood, but among aging lawmen, the tale persisted. A deputy's badge burned into earth. The law turned inward upon itself. The following year, 1915, brought a wave of excavation to southern New Mexico as surveyors prepared maps for new rail routes. A small crew under the direction of engineer Thomas Leland marked an area near the forgotten coordinates of Coyote's Hollow. Their orders were simple: assess the land for track foundations. None of them expected to uncover history. On the second day of digging, a worker's pick struck something metallic beneath the topsoil, hard, hollow, and resonant. They widened the trench and revealed the rim of a large iron kettle, cracked but intact. The foreman, sensing possible value, had it lifted carefully. Inside lay a crust of hardened residue and what appeared to be fragments of bone. Leland halted the work and notified the county sheriff. When officials arrived, they transported the kettle to Las Cruces for examination. The attending coroner, Dr. Willis Kemp, described the contents as calcined human material intermixed with animal remains. His report echoed Dr. Boone's notes from 4 decades earlier. Same texture, same smell of scorched oil. Kemp, who had read the old case files during his medical training, added in a side note, "This may be connected to the Morton affair of 1871. The pattern is exact." Newspapers seized on the coincidence. The Albuquerque Citizen ran a headline, "Deputy's Cauldron Unearthed. Old Horror Confirmed." Reporters flocked to Grant County, photographing the site and interviewing descendants of early settlers. The resulting articles mingled fact and fiction freely, reviving Ezekiel Morton's name after nearly half a century. Among those interviewed was Lucy Brandt, now in her 60s. She reluctantly agreed to speak, reminding journalists that speculation had ruined many reputations. Still, she confirmed the site matched the coordinates in her 1904 notes. When asked what she thought of the discovery, she replied simply, "Some stories were buried for a reason." The coroner's report, forwarded to the state capitol, triggered a brief review of archived testimony. The old affidavits, Jonas Reed's statement about screams by the spring, Boone's charred bone analyses, even Whitehill's correspondence, were copied for comparison. Curiously, the pages containing Morton's requisition for shackles and rendered lard were missing again. The clerk responsible for the files insisted they had been intact only days earlier. Meanwhile, strange events surrounded the excavation team. 2 laborers complained of persistent headaches and burns on their hands where they had touched the kettle. Leland himself fell ill, describing fever dreams of fire and voices murmuring legal oaths. In his journal, found later among his estate papers, he wrote, "At night the sand glows faintly. I think it breathes." To quell public anxiety, officials sealed the site and declared it closed to further exploration. The kettle was quietly transferred to a museum vault, tagged as Artifact, Origin Uncertain. Within months, a fire swept through the storage building, consuming several exhibits, including, reportedly, the kettle itself. A state bulletin published later that year made no mention of the incident, focusing instead on industrial expansion and statehood progress. Yet in the town nearest the hollow, locals told a different story, that on the night of the museum fire, a lone rider was seen moving east along the ridge, carrying a small lantern that burned with a bluish light. He vanished into the desert haze before dawn. Old men at the tavern swore it was him, the lawman who could not rest, still keeping watch over the justice he had twisted to his own creed. By 1916, the rediscovery of Coyote's Hollow had already slipped from newspaper columns, buried beneath stories of rail progress and the growing shadow of the Great War. Yet, in small towns scattered across southern New Mexico, the legend found renewed life. Preachers used it as a parable of justice gone astray. Schoolteachers warned children against cruelty disguised as duty. Still, for all the moralizing, there were those who felt the old deputy's presence more than they spoke of it. In May of that year, the owner of a modest ranch near the abandoned site, Walter Ames, wrote to the State Historical Society in Santa Fe. His letter, never formally published, survives in their archive. It read, "I have observed lights upon the ridge 3 nights running. They are steady, not like brush fires, and vanish when approached. My cattle will not graze near the spring. At dawn, I found one steer with hide blistered as if scalded, though the air was cold. I write only because the men are frightened and speak of the old deputy. I myself cannot say I disbelieve them." Ames included a sketch of the lights, 3 faint orbs forming a triangle above the ridge. When historians examined his drawing years later, they noticed that the alignment matched the original pit sites from Boone's and Leland's maps almost exactly. At the same time, a visiting geologist named Ruth Temple, conducting mineral surveys for the Bureau of Mines, noted unusual ground readings near the hollow. Her report described small pockets of gas emission rich in paraffin vapor, spontaneously igniting under certain atmospheric conditions. Temple concluded the ghost lights likely came from natural causes. Yet her assistant recalled her uneasy tone when dictating the findings. "She didn't like being there after dark," he said. "Said it felt like someone pacing just behind her." When the report reached Santa Fe, one footnote caught attention. Temple had included a brief historical aside, crediting Sheriff Harvey Whitehill's original investigation for first recording the area's instability. The citation, meant purely academic, once again tethered modern science to the old legend. Local papers couldn't resist. The next week, the Silver City Enterprise published an editorial titled, "Where the Law Still Burns." In the months that followed, hikers and fortune seekers flocked to the ruins. Some claimed to find remnants of chains embedded in stone. Others returned empty-handed but shaken, describing whispers carried on the wind, sounds like recited charges, then silence. A photographer from El Paso captured an image of the spring at dusk, the water's surface faintly steaming, reflecting what looked like a human silhouette leaning over it. He dismissed it as a trick of exposure, but the negative later cracked across the figure's outline, echoing the fate of the last deputy plate 2 decades prior. By autumn, the area was officially fenced off. The state labeled it Restricted Geological Hazard. The signposts, hammered into the sand, soon leaned with the wind, their lettering eroding until only fragments remained. Deputy, Law, Fire. That winter, Walter Ames vanished. His ranch hands found his lantern still burning in the barn and a trail of soot leading toward the ridge. Searchers scoured the hills for days, finding only a single boot print in a patch of hardened soil, too deep to match the others. When snow fell, it left that one imprint untouched, as if sealed in wax. The sheriff of the county, reading through Ames's earlier letter, wrote in his margin, "Pattern repeats." The winter of 1917 settled hard across the southern New Mexico basin, freezing the gullies and whitening the high mesa tops. The abandoned range around Coyote's Hollow turned silent again. No cattle, no campfires, only wind dragging through mesquite branches. Those who still spoke of the deputy did so quietly, mostly among older ranchers who remembered their fathers' tales. Yet even the youngest cowhands learned to avoid the area after nightfall. In January, a state archivist named George Linton arrived from Santa Fe to recover the surviving field ledgers left in the local courthouse. His project aimed to compile a final inventory of territorial anomalies before older records deteriorated completely. In the Grant County office he found, tucked between tax receipts, a thin envelope labeled Deputy Morton, 1871. The paper was brittle, the wax seal half cracked. Inside lay only a small square of cloth, stained dark and stiff, wrapped around a fragment of tarnished metal shaped vaguely like a star. Linton noted the find and requested transfer authorization to the capital. On the journey back north, his wagon overturned in a sudden storm. The driver survived. Linton did not. When the wreckage was recovered, all of the crates were accounted for except the one containing the Morton envelope. The case file vanished entirely. The official explanation, water damage, dispersal by wind, satisfied the bureaucracy. Yet in private correspondence, the driver insisted that after the crash, he saw a faint light moving away from the wreck, as though someone carried a lantern beneath the rain. The loss of the artifact seemed to seal the tale one last time. In spring, when New Mexico prepared to send men overseas for the war in Europe, the governor ordered remaining frontier records consolidated and many irrelevant files destroyed. Among them was the ledger listing the early Disapi, Irances of 1871. A clerk's later notation summarized its removal bluntly. Record expunged, content duplicated elsewhere, but no duplicate has ever surfaced. By late that year, the war overshadowed everything, and the hollow faded again into obscurity. Only one brief newspaper column, printed in the Las Cruces Weekly, noted the final cleanup of the old road near the spring. The reporter, perhaps bored by mundane work, added a single strange sentence. At dusk, the survey stakes began to hiss, their paint blistering in the cold air. The editor later removed that line from reprints, calling it poetic exaggeration. When the century closed on its first 2 decades, a handful of historians, including Lucy Brandt's successors, continued to reference the story in footnotes about territorial justice. They described it not as a haunting, but as a study in the corruption of moral order on the frontier. Still, none could fully explain the physical consistencies, the oily soil, the spontaneous burns, the recurring symbol of the star. In oral accounts recorded by traveling folklorists that same year, old ranchers still swore they sometimes saw a lone bald rider moving along the dry washes after sunset, lantern swinging from his saddle horn, its flame blue as the moon. "He ain't hunting men no more," one said softly to the interviewer, "but he's still counting them." Even the folklorist's recording, wax cylinder fragile, captured a final whisper before the old man fell silent. The law never left the hollow. It just learned to hide its face. By early 1918, only a few officials still referenced Coyote's Hollow in correspondence. The United States had entered the war, and men who once studied frontier legends were now writing reports on troop movement and ration quotas. Yet, inside the state archives in Santa Fe, archivist Margaret Hale, granddaughter of the innkeeper's widow who had once known Deputy Morton, made an entry that would quietly extend the life of the case. While sorting damaged documents for preservation, Hale discovered an unlabeled folio containing 3 brittle pages written in the same steady script found in the original county ledgers. The ink was brown, the handwriting formal, but unmistakably mid-19th century. The first page bore a heading, Coyote's Hollow, Disposition of Prisoners, March 1871. Beneath were listed 5 names, each followed by a brief note. Confessed. Remains disposed. Satisfied by lard. The final signature, faint but legible, read E. Morton, Deputy. Hale described the find to her supervisor, who instructed her to seal the papers and forward them to the territorial historian's office. Before she did, she made a copy in her private journal. In a margin she added, "If this is genuine, it confirms all local accounts, yet it reads less as cruelty than as ceremony." That same month, a small earthquake shook the southern counties, barely noticed outside the region, but recorded by local instruments. Ranchers near the old site claimed the tremor felt more like a deep thud than a quake. One herder later told a passing geologist that the ground exhaled smoke for an hour, like grease on a skillet. The geologist, recalling Sheriff Harvey Whitehill's reports, noted the event as an unexplained hydrocarbon ignition. Weeks later, Hale received a package at the archives with no return address. Inside lay her original transcription pages, the ink still fresh, though she had CR. "And only copies north." On the top sheet, someone had scrawled in new handwriting, "The work is not yet done." Security suspected a prank, perhaps a co-worker who had heard her mention the discovery, but no one admitted responsibility. The handwriting, when compared to Hale's own copy, was nearly identical to Morton's original script, save for a deeper downward stroke in the M. Shortly after, the archive's night guard reported seeing a figure moving through the hallway near the locked storage cases. He described a tall man in outdated clothes, hat in hand, lantern dim and blue. The figure paused before the sealed folio cabinet, then turned and vanished as the guard approached. When the lights were switched on, the corridor smelled faintly of burnt oil. The guard quit the next morning. Hale's health declined rapidly afterward. She developed a persistent cough and headaches that worsened under lamplight. Before resigning in the fall of 1918, she annotated her journal with a final note. "Some laws are written in ink, others in fire. Both fade when forgotten, yet one continues to burn." Her colleagues stored her papers with the rest of the unsorted archive material. In later decades, researchers rediscovering her journal would marvel at how calmly she described the events, as if documenting an illness rather than an encounter. When asked years later whether she believed the legend, an elderly colleague of Hale's answered, "She believed in evidence, but she also believed evidence could remember." The year 1919 closed with a sense of uneasy normalcy across the Southwest. War veterans returned home to quiet towns, the influenza epidemic waned, and the last reminders of the territorial era seemed to dissolve into the new century. Yet, in the small circle of historians who traded letters between Santa Fe, Silver City, and Tucson, the name Coyote's Hollow still appeared with stubborn regularity, always in the margins, always accompanied by odd omissions. In January, a retired lawman named Joseph McCready sent a letter to the Santa Fe New Mexican describing an encounter he swore occurred decades earlier. He had been a young deputy under Sheriff Harvey Whitehill in the 1870s and recalled traveling east through a dust storm, meeting a rider with a covered lantern. The man introduced himself as Deputy Morton, out of Mesilla, and warned him not to take the canyon road ahead. McCready turned back, and days later heard of 3 rustlers found dead along that same road, burned, though no campfire or lightning strike was found. "He spoke like a preacher, not a killer," McCready wrote, and his eyes shone as if reflecting someone else's fire. The paper printed only a fragment of his letter, cutting the rest for space. But the original, archived by McCready's grandson, includes a final paragraph. "If he still rides, it is not as a man bound by badge or country. It is as the law that forgot mercy." That spring, a photographer named Benjamin Wyatt undertook an expedition to document ghost towns across southern New Mexico. His glass plates, discovered years later, show desolate homesteads and crumbling wells, but one image stands apart. Labeled simply Hollow, March 1919, it captures the faint outline of a man standing beside a dry spring, his head bare, his coat long and dark. The exposure is slightly overdeveloped, and the figure's face is obscured by glare. Experts later determined that no one from Wyatt's party appeared in that frame. In a private letter to his wife, Wyatt wrote, "The plate hissed as it cooled, like something alive. The men won't camp near the ridge again." He sent the negatives to Santa Fe, but never returned for them. 2 months later, his body was found outside Deming, his camera smashed, his hands blackened as if by soot. Meanwhile, Margaret Hale's earlier discovery began to circulate quietly among academics. A historian at the University of New Mexico, Dr. Stephen Cross, prepared a paper titled "The Morton Ledger and Ritualized Justice in the Territorial Period." He argued that Morton's acts represented a distorted theology of purification rather than insanity. The day before presenting his findings, he withdrew abruptly, citing ill health. His manuscript was never found. Only a note remained on his desk reading, "Heat in the walls, can't breathe here." During that same summer, travelers through Grant County reported fresh disturbances near the ridge, newly turned soil, small pits filled with rainwater that steamed under sunlight, and an acrid smell spreading for miles after storms. Locals took to calling it the deputy's breath. A final county notice that autumn declared the entire basin off-limits for grazing due to mineral instability. Behind closed doors, officials admitted the soil samples contained unusually high levels of animal fat. No one could explain how. When asked decades later what finally ended the legend, one elderly clerk who had filed those last reports replied quietly, "It never ended. We just stopped writing it down." In the early months of 1920, the Grant County Courthouse received a peculiar delivery, a small wooden box with no return address, wrapped in wax cloth and sealed with a star-shaped impression. Inside was a single lantern, its glass blackened with soot, but intact. The clerk who opened it claimed it still smelled faintly of oil and lard, as if recently used. No note accompanied it, only a slip of parchment tucked beneath the handle, bearing 4 words in careful script. "The light abides here." The clerk, unnerved, logged the item as unidentified donation and placed it in the basement evidence room. 2 weeks later, that same clerk resigned abruptly, citing persistent headaches and dreams of boiling water. When another employee went to retrieve the lantern for inventory, the shelf where it had been placed was empty. The entry remained in the logbook, uncorrected. Around that time, a local priest named Father Ignacio Morales began collecting parish stories from older residents in the area once known as Coyote's Hollow. He recorded oral confessions from families who had remained in those isolated valleys since the 1870s. Many recounted a single figure, a silent man who appeared at night when justice was ignored. Some called him the Bald Deputy, others El Aceite, the Oil. Father Morales, cautious but curious, kept his notes factual. In his journal he wrote, "They speak of purification through fire, but none claim to have seen a fire burn, only the light after." By summer, Morales visited the ridge himself. He carried holy water and a small wooden cross. When he returned, his companions described him as shaken and pale. He refused to explain what he had witnessed, saying only, "The ground is still working." Within a month, he transferred to another parish near Albuquerque and never spoke publicly of the hollow again. Meanwhile, in Santa Fe, archivists, revisiting the Hale folio, discovered something they could not easily dismiss. The 3 pages once written by Deputy Morton, those listing prisoner names and final notations, had changed. The ink, once faded to brown, now appeared darker, as though freshly rewritten, and beneath the original entries, a new line had emerged in a different hand. Account continued by the hand of witness. No one admitted to altering the papers. The pages were resealed and stored, this time under lock. Later that year, geologists from the State University conducted soil tests near the hollow to confirm mineral rights. Their instruments detected pockets of trapped methane mixed with high concentrations of organic residue, paraffin, fat, traces of calcium. The lead geologist remarked that it was as if the ground itself had absorbed decades of rendering. His report never reached publication. The field office where it was stored suffered a sudden electrical fire that consumed every record. In the winter of 1920, residents of Silver City noticed an old bald man walking through the market square just before dawn, coat collar pulled high, eyes downcast. He carried a lantern that emitted no visible flame, yet cast a faint glow on the stones beneath his feet. When approached by a constable, the man stopped, lifted his hat politely, and said, "I serve where law sleeps." Then he disappeared into the morning fog, leaving behind only the smell of burnt oil. No one ever confirmed who he was. But an elderly witness, decades later, told a reporter that the man's badge caught the first light of day, and for a second, it looked like it was still burning. The 1920s brought railroads, telephones, and the slow fading of the frontier. Yet, beneath the surface of progress, the hollow remained a name no one used easily. Survey maps still mark the region as unstable ground, though the underlying geology had long since settled. To the few who remembered, it was not the earth that was unstable. It was memory itself, refusing to lie still. In 1921, a traveling journalist named Clara Wendell passed through Silver City collecting accounts of the last territorial sheriffs. She hoped to write a book titled Law and Dust. Among the old papers shown to her at the county hall was a brittle envelope marked Hale Journal Extracts. Inside were Margaret Hale's transcriptions of Morton's ledger and her own closing note, "Some laws burn quietly." Clara copied the line, intrigued, and rode south toward the supposed site of Coyote's Hollow. What she found there, recorded later in a letter to her editor, was not much. A depression in the sand, a dry spring, and a faint ring of stone half buried beneath dust. "It feels," she wrote, "as if something once happened here that the ground prefers not to remember." She spent one night camping nearby. Her letter continues. "At midnight there came a low hum, like a kettle warming, and the lantern dimmed, though the air was still. I smelled old oil, and for a heartbeat the sand beside my tent sank as if something heavy stepped upon it. When dawn came, the depression remained, one print, wide and bare of heel." Clara returned to town and mailed her notes east. The package arrived. She did not. The last confirmed sighting placed her at the Las Cruces station, waiting for a train that never departed due to a storm. Her name appeared weeks later on a list of missing travelers presumed stranded, then vanished from the record altogether. The editor published her incomplete notes posthumously under the Sayone. The title, "The Hollow That Hums." Though modestly circulated, the piece reignited public imagination. Readers speculated wildly. Some called Morton a demon, others a martyr of justice. Academics protested, insisting the story be left to folklore, not fact. But there was one curious footnote added by the editor. He claimed that the photograph accompanying her article, a grainy shot of Clara's tent at dawn, had not been taken by her. It arrived anonymously with the manuscript. In the lower corner, just visible in the shadow, stood the outline of a man holding a lantern, its light faint and blue. Later, the editor's assistant developed the negative again under brighter exposure. The man's features remained indistinct, but on the breast of his coat, where a badge should have been, the film showed a small white flare. It had burned directly into the emulsion, leaving a star-shaped void. In 1923, a visiting scholar lecturing in Santa Fe referenced the case while discussing Sheriff Harvey Whitehill and the perils of frontier justice. He ended his talk with a line that lingered uncomfortably in the auditorium. "Some laws die when the man dies. Others walk on, wearing his shape." Afterward, an audience member approached him, a quiet woman, middle-aged, carrying a notebook bound in oil-stained leather. She thanked him for keeping the record open. When she left, she forgot the notebook on her chair. Inside, archivists later found sketches of the hollow, clippings of old newspaper articles, and a final sentence written across the back cover. "He still counts the guilty, but now the desert keeps score." By 1924, New Mexico was well into its new statehood, and modernity crept even into the most forgotten valleys. Gasoline replaced lamp oil, electric lights replaced lanterns, and Coyote's Hollow, officially erased from surveyor charts, seemed destined to vanish into rumor. Yet, as often happens with stories that refuse burial, it returned through accident. That summer, a road crew working to extend Highway 180 toward Deming unearthed a layer of blackened soil beneath the route. Their foreman described it as hard as glass, slick like wax. Beneath it lay several fused iron links and what appeared to be a section of scorched wood framing. Local inspectors noted the material had a strong odor of burnt tallow. The crew joked uneasily about finding the deputy's frying pan, until a worker burned his hand simply by touching the ground. They poured water to cool it. The water steamed. Word reached the Silver City Enterprise, which sent a young reporter, Thomas Alvey, to document the find. Alvey interviewed the workers, photographed the trench, and spent a night at the site. His article, published under the headline "Heat in the Earth," maintained a skeptical tone, but ended with an odd detail. At midnight, the road lights flickered, and from the ridge came the sound of metal settling in oil. The editor later trimmed that line, calling it too literary. Still, Alvey's curiosity lingered. In follow-up notes found decades later among his personal effects, he wrote of returning alone to the site with a local guide. The man refused to approach the hollow after dark, so Alvey went on foot. What he described reads like a field report turned confession. The soil glowed faintly where the black layer breaks. I saw footprints, not recent but impressed deep, barefoot, each toe distinct. I placed my lantern beside one and waited. The ground trembled lightly, rhythmic, as if from a hammer striking beneath. Then the light dimmed. I smelt the same foul sweetness everyone mentions. I called out once, no answer, and yet I heard chains move somewhere close, very slow. He ended the account mid-sentence. Alvey returned to town the next morning, pale and shaking. 2 days later, he boarded a train for El Paso and never resumed his post. Meanwhile, the state's new geological survey dismissed the site as oil seep ignition, possibly spontaneous, repeating Ruth Temple's earlier conclusion nearly word for word. Privately, one inspector confided to colleagues that the air itself feels heavy there, as if something wants to rise, but can't. At the same time, small reports trickled in from homesteads along the new road. Lanterns seen moving against the wind, the faint smell of grease drifting for miles, livestock refusing to drink from puddles formed after rain. No official notices were filed, but the county quietly posted wooden signs, unmarked except for a hand-carved star and the number 11871. Travelers who passed that way said the signs looked recently varnished, though no one ever saw who maintained them. That autumn, a state archivist revising the Index of Territorial Records found a single entry added in unfamiliar handwriting at the end of the Morton file. Account balanced, justice rendered. It bore no initials, yet the flourish of the M matched the century-old signature from the Coyote's Hollow ledger. When the archivist showed it to his supervisor, the ink was still wet. The winter of 1925 was one of the coldest in memory across southern New Mexico. Frost coated the arroyos, and the desert wind howled through the canyons like an organ in mourning. Travelers rarely ventured through the badlands near the hollow. Those who did reported that even the sand seemed frozen into glassy ripples, slick underfoot. The railroad ran clear across the county now, but train conductors still lowered their voices when passing mile marker 187, where the ridge of the old spring could be seen faintly from the tracks. It was during one of these crossings that the story re-emerged once more in an official but unexplainable way. A maintenance worker named Luis Romero, inspecting the line at dawn, noticed that a section of gravel beside the rail had melted overnight, cooled into a smooth, translucent crust. Embedded within it was a single iron badge, distorted but recognizable as a 5-pointed star. He pried it free with a crowbar. When washed, the badge revealed faint engraving beneath the corrosion. E.M. Deputy, 1871. Romero turned the artifact over to the station master in Deming, who sent it north to the State Historical Bureau. There, Curator Ruth Cavanaugh verified the engraving under magnification. Her typed report read simply, "Badge consistent with territorial law enforcement issue, circa 1870s. Surface marked by high heat exposure, possibly chemical." The badge was placed in a display case labeled "Recovered Relics of Early Law." For 2 months, it remained there, until a visitor reported that the glass above it grew cloudy from the inside, as if smoked. The next morning, the curator found the display case empty. No signs of forced entry, only the faint smell of burnt oil lingering in the air. The janitor swore the haze took hours to clear. That spring, Cavanaugh left her post and moved east, writing to a colleague that she no longer trusted what the archives choose to keep. Her letter ends with one cryptic sentence. Some evidence does not wish to be preserved. It wishes to continue. In the following weeks, strange incidents were noted along the rail. Telegraph operators received bursts of static shaped into brief, coherent pulses, 5 at a time, recurring every night near midnight, resembling the pattern of Morse for the letter E. An engineer on the night run to Lordsburg described seeing a dim blue lantern swinging along the ridge parallel to the train for nearly a mile before vanishing. When the locomotive stopped, the smell of grease drifted through the carriages. By summer, superstition had returned in full. Track workers began leaving small offerings near the stretch of rail, coins, polished stones, sometimes a tin cup half filled with oil. They said it was to keep the deputy settled. Supervisors laughed, but did not forbid it. In August, when lightning struck the ridge during a storm, no fire followed, only a deep, echoing boom that rolled beneath the earth like the closing of a furnace door. Weeks later, a telegram arrived at the Santa Fe Historical Bureau, unsigned and written in the same curt style found in 19th-century law reports. It read, "Justice served, case ongoing." The clerk who received it filed it by instinct under Coyote's Hollow, 1871, though the code on the telegraph wire showed it had originated from a remote switching station, one that had been closed for years.